David Ghantt was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, a poor man by every definition, yet every single day he handled millions in cash. 16 hours a day, he was surrounded by stacks of money, but his own pockets, always empty. David was a supervisor for an armored car at a company called Loomis Fargo, a security firm responsible for transferring millions of dollars between banks. Day after day, he guarded other people's fortunes, and yet his own salary was barely $8 an hour. He tried to live under the heavy blanket of honesty, smothering his dreams. But how long could he endure? How long before the weight of a thankless life crushed him completely? One day, David reached his breaking point, and from that moment he began to think about doing something wrong. This is the unbelievable story of the 1997 Loomis Fargo bank heist, a robbery so audacious that the FBI was forced to launch an international manhunt. A crime so bizarre, it later became the inspiration for the 2016 Hollywood movie Masterminds. Ironically, David himself even worked on that film but received no money for it. Welcome back to Gem TV. David Ghantt was no stranger to sacrifice. A retired soldier who had once fought in the Gulf War, he had served his country with honor. But civilian life was cruel. At Loomis Fargo, he was responsible for armored transports filled with cash. In his hands, millions. In his wallet, nothing. And on his shoulders, the crushing burden of family responsibility. David worked 75 to 80 hours a week, yet he was paid a measly $5.50 an hour. His life had become a prison of routine. Loneliness and frustration ate away at him. The emptiness, the disappointment of never doing something big, all of it stirred a restless fire inside him. A dangerous one. And when temptation came knocking, it wore the face of a woman named Kelly Campbell. Kelly also worked at Loomis Fargo. She was bold, sharp, and mysterious. During their time together, she and David became friends. Friends close enough to keep meeting even after Kelly left the job. One day, Kelly introduced David to her friend, Steve Chambers. Steve was a petty criminal, always chasing get-rich-quick schemes. The moment Steve discovered David was an armored truck supervisor, his mind lit up with one reckless idea: rob the money. But this idea needed David on board. So, together, Steve and Kelly began to persuade him. David was already teetering on the edge. Steve's plan was like a final push against a crumbling wall. At first, David resisted. He'd never committed a crime in his life. But Steve's charm, Kelly's encouragement, and his own suffocating frustration, it was too much. David gave in, and the planning began. Now, none of them were professionals. Steve was a small-time crook, Kelly had zero experience, and David? He was just a man drowning in desperation. Their plan was so simple, so sloppy, that any real thief would have laughed at it. The plan. On the night of October 4th, 1997, David would stay late after his shift. He'd shut off the cameras, steal the surveillance tapes, load the van with cash, and drive away. From there, David would escape to Mexico with just $50,000, the maximum amount allowed to cross the border without declaration. The rest of the money would stay with Steve. Later, once things cooled down, they'd all split the fortune equally. But there was one glaring flaw. If David ran to Mexico with just $50,000, what guarantee was there that Steve would share millions later? Still blinded by greed, David never asked that question, and then the night arrived. October 4th, 1997. At 6 p.m., David sent his trainee home. Alone with the vault under his control, his hands shook with fear. But he followed the plan. He disabled 2 cameras. He pulled the surveillance tape. But in his nervousness, he missed a 3rd camera hidden in the corner. That single mistake would capture everything. Unaware, David began hauling cash. But this wasn't like counting and transporting money as part of his job. This time, he was emptying the vault, alone, in a hurry. Most of the bills were in 20s, mountains of them. Over 8,000 bundles, more than $17.3 million in total. For 2 hours straight, David stuffed the van with cash. When it was finally done, he had unknowingly committed the 2nd largest cash robbery in American history. Overcome with joy, he even danced inside the vault, his little victory dance, forever recorded by that 3rd camera. The next morning, when employees arrived, they couldn't open the vault. The keys were gone, police were called, David was missing. Immediately, he became the prime suspect. The tapes confirmed everything: the missing millions, the guilty man, and yes, even the ridiculous victory dance. But the footage revealed something else. David had been sending messages on his pager during the robbery. He wasn't alone. The hunt began. Within 2 days, FBI agents found the abandoned cash van in the woods. Inside, surveillance tapes and around $3 million left behind, too heavy, too rushed to carry. That meant David and his partners still had around $14 million in untraceable cash. Meanwhile, David slipped into Mexico with his $50,000. Relaxing at a luxury beach resort, he thought he had escaped. Back in the US, the FBI launched a nationwide appeal. Ads were published. A $500,000 reward was announced for any information. Citizens were asked to report anyone who suddenly came into suspicious amounts of money. Calls poured in, most useless. But then came the one that cracked the case. A man reported that his neighbor had suddenly gotten rich. That neighbor was none other than Steve Chambers. The FBI began tailing him. Soon it became obvious Steve and his wife Michelle were burning through cash. They bought a luxury home, a brand new BMW, expensive toys and treasures. Investigators checked their bank accounts. Since the night of October 4th, massive deposits had appeared, all in 20s. One bank teller even recalled Michelle asking how much money could be deposited before the bank was required to alert the feds. Suspicion turned into certainty. Steve and Michelle were in on it. But the FBI stayed quiet. They wanted the whole crew, especially David. Within 10 days, the case unraveled further. The FBI tapped Steve's phone. On one call, his words sent chills. He was plotting David's murder. Steve had no intention of splitting the money. The plan's fatal flaw had caught up with David. Steve wanted him dead in Mexico. The FBI moved quickly, arresting one of Steve's associates, Mike McKinney. Under pressure, Mike confessed everything. He revealed where the cash had been transferred and confirmed David's location in Mexico. Shockingly, Steve had used his own workplace parking lot, the printing press where he worked, to move the money from one vehicle to another. And because of their sloppy rush, they'd abandoned millions in the getaway van, barely a stone's throw from the Loomis Fargo warehouse. The FBI had their case, but they waited, gathering rock-solid evidence. 5 months later, on March 1st, 1998, David Ghantt was arrested in Mexico. The very next day, Steve, Michelle, and Kelly Campbell were taken into custody in North Carolina. In total, 88% of the stolen money was recovered. The rest spent on Steve's luxury shopping spree. Justice was swift. Steve Chambers received 11 years in prison, David Ghantt 7 years. He was also saddled with the missing $3 million, even though he had never touched it. Years later, in 2016, Hollywood turned this bizarre heist into a comedy film, Masterminds. David worked as a consultant on the movie, but by law he couldn't be paid. Any money would go directly toward his debt. At the time, David was working as a construction laborer. Even if I worked my whole life, he admitted, I'd never be able to pay back that debt. Today, David Ghantt lives in Jacksonville, Florida, with his wife and children. He still works construction, and through social media he shares his story, warning others not to repeat his mistakes. And that, dear viewers, was the story of one of America's strangest bank robberies. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your love and support mean everything. We'll see you in the next one.